Alright students, this is going to be a tutorial about how to create some morphing mountains. To get started, we're going to use a shape here. I'm going to make a circle, and this is going to serve as the base of my land, my planar objects. I'm going to use this technique to make sure that I have a rounded edge instead of like a rectangular edge. If I was to start with a plane, like a rectangular plane, this technique will work with any shape that's closed, so it would work with a rectangle. Even a donut is closed, a star, and so on. So you can explore that, but I'm going to start with the circle. And one thing I did adjust is the interpolation. I set this to adaptive, the difference being that optimized is going to try to reduce the appearance of, well, the existence of as many points as possible, whereas adaptive is going to prioritize looking nice and smooth at any size. I'm going to round this out to 200 units. That's going to give me a 400 meter diameter. One thing I did do was to update my system units to meters instead of the default inches or centimeters. Meters is just going to give me kind of the closer to real world size that I want, without having to, be super scaled up or work really far out from my home grid here. So it's a good idea to make sure you adjust your units based on the objects and the scale that you want. So I just centered this to 0, 0. And from here, I can just add a modifier called retopologize or retopology. And what this is going to do is actually convert my mesh to, well, convert my spline to a polygonal mesh. And based on the settings here, it'll try to give me a polygon count based on the face count here. It'll generate that to create new topology. So I'm going to go ahead and compute and see what it gives us at 5,000. I do have edge faces on so I can observe. And this will be good to get us started with just a base mesh. And just to kind of see the actual results of this, I'm going to take a moment to set up my statistics, my scene statistics. So I'm going to go to my configure viewports. That's the viewport options, the plus sign, configure viewports, find the statistics tab. I like to monitor the polygons, triangles, and vertex count. Don't need frames per second, and always choose between total edge selection or total, but I will go ahead and apply this. You do have the option to show here, then apply, and that should show up in your viewport. Otherwise, you can use the number 7 key above your, it's the alphanumeric 7, and that will toggle your stats in the top left corner of your viewport. So in actuality, this selected object is right at 5,000. It did pretty good, but that's more of a range, and then quad tolerance and some of these other parameters for this modifier can kind of tweak that higher or lower. But it's a good starting point. The main thing is my edge is nice and rounded, so as I rotate this for renders, I won't get a harsh corner to avoid. Alright, from here, now that I've got a quad base mesh, I can actually collapse this. This is just going to save on resources. It is going to delete the history of my object, so it's not going to understand that it was a circle at one point, a circle at which I can still currently adjust the radius and other, well, that's the main parameter for your circle, but if you're using a different shape, you might have other parameters you can still adjust at this point. With retopology, because you are converting to polygons, you would have to regenerate and let it recompute based on whatever new parameters you set in the history beforehand. But what we're going to do is right click on the top modifier and just go to collapse to. and we'll confirm that, and that erases that history. So this is just my base object, and it's generated a planar mesh with quads that has a rounded border. Okay. Now this is in editable poly mode, so I could jump right in and start deforming and modeling my landscape as I have in the past with other demonstrations. But what we're going to do is take advantage of the modifier stack and kind of leverage the history from here on out. So eventually we're going to kind of add some detail to this, and then we're going to add some variation. So we're going to add another kind of set of detail and be able to switch between the two, and ultimately we're going to capture those as morph targets using our Morpher modifier, and that's going to allow us to get an interesting animation like you may have seen in the example. Alright, so again, it's a little redundant, but I'm actually going to add a new modifier. This modifier is going to serve as a kind of a new chapter in the history of this object. Right? So I did condense the history for this layer, but adding this next edit poly is going to give me the same control with the option to turn it on and off in terms of how it affects my base, that is the underneath version of the object. So I'm going to take advantage of that, and in my edit poly layer I'm going to use the I'm actually going to guide my paint deformations. I'm going to use that technique to raise the major details of my landscape, but I'm going to guide it with the use of a soft selection. So I'm going to activate one of my sub-object selection modes. I'm actually going to go to the top view here and reactivate my grid and turn on wireframe. What I'm trying to do here is just find the center point, which is way up. What I'm going to do first is just observe what my center is. This is what I want to know. So this is the centermost of the, and you can see that the pivot is there and it's placed on the origin. The reason why I don't have geometry that lines up there is just because of the calculation of the retopology. But this is going to give me a good starting point for my selection to make sure that it goes out somewhat evenly in each direction. So start there at the physical center of my object. I'm actually going to grow this. I'm going to turn on my use soft selection. I'm going to try to grow this so that there's full selections in the middle, and try to go toward the edge as much as possible, and I'm just going to start increasing my fall off. Okay. Another method I could use is try to find a nice edge ring or a polygon selection ring. So I could start with one polygon and double click holding control on an adjacent polygon, and if I grow from here I should get a kind of a more rounded result. That's looking better. So I want to grow until it's solid in the middle. It's a couple more clicks, and then thankfully just before that edge is selected I'm actually going to back it way out until I get blue around the edge here. So I'm going to increase my fall off and actually shrink this back just a little bit more. I'm just making a wider fall off range, and what that selection is going to allow me to do is I'm going to hold control here, by the way, and convert my selection back to vertices. So holding control and selecting on the selection mode here, selecting a new icon is going to convert my current selection to a different sub-object group. Okay. So now I've got this nice kind of gradual selection here, and I'm actually going to pull this up just like this, just a little bit to get started. Yeah, I that's just gonna, so I want this to be, you know, something that, like an island that could be surrounded by water. So this will just even out how the water edge interacts with the rest of the landmass geometry. So if you can imagine, this is going to be like a smooth beach, but has rocky elevations in the middle. Alright, so I've got my selection, soft selection, kind of directing where I want to impact my mesh. I'm going to scroll down to my paint deformations, go ahead and activate push pull. Just taking a quick look at the size of my brush. I'm going to bring that way up to somewhere around 4 or 5 times the size. So that'd be like 80 to 100 units in this case. That's meters. And I can kind of increase my push pull value a bit, but this is going to be kind of a balance between, let's see, edge face mode is kind of being overridden by the selection right now. But can just check the profile as we go. Just kind of switch to perspective mode. Just kind of going over the same places a few times will give you higher and higher elevation in that place. You can alternate between the control and the alt key. Control is going to be a shortcut for revert, and alt is going to switch between push and pull. So by default it's actually pull. If you hold the alt key down, it goes to push, so you push down back into the geometry. Get any pinches or things that you don't really want, relax will help smooth those things out, and you can always kind of go back and get a little bit more fine detail. Again, these are just the larger features of the land, and this is just the first pass. We're actually going to make 1 or 2 more of these the same way. Okay, so I'm good with that. Okay, so we will kind of stop here for this first pass, and I'll actually continue with the second. I'm just going to turn this first one off, and I'm going to add a new modifier, a new edit poly modifier. Okay, and just to show you the edge faces again, still reading from the bottom base layer, that's still on, but I've completely turned off the effects of the initial edit poly. But of course, if I turn that back on, you can see that effect. So we're just going to hide that there. I'm actually going to take a moment, and if you right click on the name of your, or the label of your modifier, you can rename it. So I'm going to call this EP for edit poly. I'm going to call this mountain or terrain 1, something like that. I could go ahead and rename the second one, call it EP for edit poly, and this will be mountain 2. And I'm going to repeat those, the same steps that I did. I'm going to find a good selection to go with. I'm going to turn on my use soft selects, grow until it meets in the middle, and then fan it out with my fall off. Of course, I could change the profile of my fall off as well with the pinch and bubble. I'm going to pull this up just a little bit and reactivate my push pull, increase my brush size, start off a little smaller this time, maybe with a little bit more strength in the push-pull value. That'll go a little bit quicker. This time I'm going to make kind of like a cove. So maybe a little bit smaller here. And you can see as I get toward that edge, let me go back and push these back in to create an interesting ridge here. But my fall off is keeping my elevation away from pulling up on that edge. It's very helpful for controlling the effects that I'm applying here. I'm going to relax these just a bit with a larger brush, just to soften that just a bit. These I'm going to revert with a weak brush. And kind of pack that down a little bit. Relax them, just evens out the topology. You can see the stretch on the polygons gets reduced with the relax technique. Go back to my push-pull, and I'm going to hold Alt here and kind of push this down so it kind of creates a water inlet. Rein this back a lot. Alright, so there's my second variation, and I'm happy with that. Okay, so next we're going to add some finer details with the noise modifier. Now in order to do that, I'm going to need to subdivide this just a little bit more, and I'm going to subdivide it with a modifier once again, so that as my history reads from the bottom to the top, it passes through the subdivider. In this case, I'm just going to use a turbo smooth, and turbo smooth is just going to it's going to allow me to have a certain number of iterations that I want, and it's also going to kind of add a relax a little bit to some of those kind of stretched peaks and stuff here. And it will adapt to both of those versions that I'm going to capture as more targets in the future. So I'm going to start with Mountain 1, and once again I want to use a selection to direct where my effects are applied. In this case I'm going to use the noise modifier. So just to show you what that's going to look like, if I just drop in the noise modifier, or modifier, without any other selections here. As a matter of fact, I can deactivate this with the push-pull deformations. That should stay intact regardless of the selection mode being active. The turbo smooth is going to subdivide it. I can even go maybe one more just to get some really fine detail in. So you can see that conforms, or just subdivides based on this version of my mountain. And then I'm going to start adding the noise on top. Now, I'm going to increase my Z and decrease my scale. Now, I'm decreasing my scale so that I can see the noise pattern start to appear across my mesh. If you have a different scene units set up, you may be in need of going at a higher scale instead of lower. Okay. I'm going to turn on my fractal here. That's going to give me even finer details, and it's going to be closer to what I want. But notice how the noise is impacting every inch or every polygon of my mesh here. I want this to look kind of like it might have like a sandy beach, so something that's not so jagged on the outside. I just want the noise detail to be concentrated on the elevations that I pushed and pulled in. So this is where we're going to add another selection modifier. You can use another edit poly that's got selection options, but instead we're going to go back to our turbo smooth. We need the selection to happen after the subdivided mesh, so we're going to put that above our turbo smooth. I'm going to do a search for poly select. This is going to allow me to select polygons. You can see this is reading the version of the mesh that goes through the Mountain 1 modifier, that's active, and the subdivided mesh from turbo smooth. So for this technique, I'm going to go to a orthographic projection. It's going to look the same from the front or the left or the back or the right. And what I'm trying to do is just select the parts that have been kind of moved up or away from the flat edge here on the sides. Like if you look on the very corners, this will be the part that was not elevated. And I'm actually going to use soft selection here once again, and I can kind of let me I'm going to shrink this way back first, and then I'll add this kind of pushed in basin as part of the selection as well. I'm going to go back to my perspective view, and what this soft selection is going to allow is for this red area to be impacted only by the noise at the top of the modifier stack. And I'm going to try to get this a little more visible. Okay, so now the noise, the agitation, kind of tapers off according to my selection. I may actually go back in here and I'm going to shrink this back even further and really increase, let that get caught up, really increase my fall off quite a bit. And we'll go in and just grab that just so we get some noise at the bottom of that valley there. So now I'll go back up and check my work, just deselect, and yeah, now that gradual tapering off kind of goes to a smoother edge there. Okay, so I'm going to name this, rename this, call this poly select, and I'll just put M01 for Mountain 1. And these will be coupled together. I'm going to turn this one off, and the poly select that corresponds to it off, and turn on my second mountain detail. And I'll add another edit poly, or excuse me, poly select. Kind of repeat that selection technique. I'm going to go to a front view, try to grab these top peaks and some of the bottom valleys there, activate a soft selection, really ramp up that fall off. And again, I'm just kind of monitoring that my selection kind of stays isolated. I'm actually going to deselect these. Try to stay away from that edge. So maybe deselect those and just concentrate the noise application to the red areas here mostly. Probably going to shrink this back even further and increase the fall off. Smooth that out. And then I can see the same noise values are going to be applied, so I don't have to readjust those. And turning on my solid mode, I can see it's a good distribution of my noise detail just on the peaked or the pushed and pulled, deformed sections of my mesh. It's looking good. Now is a good time to save. Alright, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my poly select name for MO2. There are other techniques that you can utilize, like data channel, to kind of automate or proceduralize the selection based on, I think, the deformations, curvature, or the extruded values off the base mesh. That's a little more complex than you need to go if you want to do something like this. So I'm just kind of compensating for that with the coupling of my edit mesh and a corresponding poly select where I need it in my history. Okay, so from here I'm going to add my morph. That is my morpher modifier. Your morph modifier, morpher modifier. I keep misspeaking because there is an option in your compound objects related to morph. This is going to change the complete nature of your object, and it's actually a little more limited in the options and the control that you have compared to the modifier version. So I like to use the Morpher modifier, but it works in the same principle. It captures the state or references similar objects, and they have to be identical in their polygon count. So rather than making duplicated objects, and you can see here this is in the hundreds of thousands of triangles, and I believe this is actually based on my selection right now. Yeah, so if I reduce my selection points, you see a truer representation of what those polygons are. And yeah, so that's a stipulation of using morph or the morpher modifier, is that you have to have identical poly counts. So this technique ensures that your polygon count is going to be the same for all of the morph targets. So yeah, we can get started with storing these. So the very first one, I'm actually going to store the flat version of my object here. So I'm going to turn off the noise. I'm going to turn off my selections. I'm going to keep the turbo smooth because that's impacting the number of sub-objects that are in my mesh. I'm going to turn off the effects of Mountain 01. Hit G to turn off my grid. Okay, so you can still see it's just as dense because of the turbo smooth, but it's nice and flat. So for this technique, in the Morpher layer, in my Morpher panel, I'm going to use the option to capture current state. I'm making sure that my empty container for my morph targets is activated. You can put this in any one, but I'm going to use the one on the top and go to capture current state and call this state 1 or flat or some other descriptor. Go to accept, and you can see the name shows there, and the percentage is actually going to drive the influence of the mesh, and that's the power of the morpher target. You'll see that here in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and prepare for my next phase or my next morph target, and we're going to use the Mountain 1. I'm going to activate the selection for Mountain 1 and make sure that noise is reactivated. And now in the morpher targets, I'm going to hit capture. And this will be, call this M01, accept. Alright. So now, if I start to use the influences here, what's happening is it's blending between these two states of my mesh. So with zero flatness, if you will, I see the full version of my Mountain 01. I'm going to go ahead and load in MountainMountains2. So deactivate 01, activate MountainMountains2, activate selection for the MountainMountains2, and the noise is then placed on those peaks. Morpher, ready to capture this current state. This will be M02. Accept. And now I can effectively transition between my different kind of variations of this one object. Now, Morpher actually stores all of this position data in itself in the modifier through the software. So again, to eliminate some of the concerns about the history and the chugging resources and things like that, at this point I could actually reduce and collapse my history. I definitely want to save a version of this so that I can make corrections of this if I want to at this point. I can recall this point, but otherwise I can just go ahead and right click here. It needs to be at the very top by itself, and let me see, the hindrance here I believe is my selection. What's happening? Nope, it's right here. I'm just looking for collapse 2. And that's basically going to preserve the state of everything here. I'm going to take one more precaution. I'm actually going to I'm going to make it the flat version to start with. So turning off the noise, keeping my turbo smooth, turning off the different versions of the elevations, and I'm going to right click again and go to collapse 2. Go to yes. Alright, and then I can test my Morpher. Okay, so you can see that it recalls. I can even add the effects of these on top of each other, so both of these at 100% is actually going to add more elevation and give me a new and interesting version of my mountains here. And you can do whatever variations you like. Okay, so now I'm going to add some keyframes to this. Activate auto key. I'll keep the default number of frames. I'm more concerned just about capturing the motion, and I can do that just by separating out 1 to 2 seconds worth of frames. I'll actually start at 15 frames, which is about half a second, and with my auto key activated, I will increase the value for Mountain 01, and on second thought I do want kind of a pause or a gap. So what you see here with auto key, as you look closely, I've got 2 keyframes that have generated. The first keyframe is the 0 value for the target influence here, and it ramps up to 100 at this frame. What I'm going to do is just drag these over a bit so that the first frame is at 0, or sorry, the 0 value is at the 15, and so starting at frame 15 is when I'll see that increase. So it's going to go from flat for a half second and then ramp up to 100% of Mountain 1, and I can actually create a small pause here by holding shift, just like you can shift and drag to duplicate your mesh, make clones. You can shift and drag to duplicate your keyframes. I don't need this one, but what this is going to do is ensure that for this 10 frames or so, that this is going to be static. It's going to be no changes, so it's going to be static. And then let's do a full second. So 30 frames. I'm going to add the increase here, So that's the double combination. And one thing to note is because I just added a new keyframe to MO2, I actually need to go back to that previous keyframe, not the first keyframe, but the previous one, and actually drop this down to 0 once again, because by default with auto key, that new keyframe basically generates a 0 keyframe at the very first, a 0 value at the very first frame. So making sure that that doesn't increase until after or at the 40th frame is going to give me the effect that I want. So it's going to start growing with both influences there. Okay, I'm going to advance 10 more seconds. And I'm actually going to duplicate that one again. And I did a sweep selection, so that should capture all the keyframes that are there. So it should be identical right through here for all my values. And what I'm going to do for the next 15 seconds, or sorry, 15 frames, half a second, is then drop off the value for M01. Something really cool. And I'm actually going to use the last 6 frames to quickly drop this down to 0. So I kind of have a looping animation here. So I'm going to let this play. And it's pretty fast. So I have options here. I can increase the timing. I'm actually going to pull this back so that the gap is a little more even. There we go. So I'll continue to tweak this to my liking. But to finalize and prepare this for render, I'm going to add a couple of lights. Instead of just a singular light source I have in the past, that was specifically an Arnold lights. So going to the Create tab, switching to your light category, and finding Arnold, activating your Arnold button for Arnold light, that is, and dropping that object in. Once I do that, I'm going to go to my modifier tab and start adjusting some of the parameters. So I'm going to start with a direct light once again, or sorry, a distant light. I do want to add the target node, and I'm just going to center this on the origin, and then I can reposition the light however I see fit. But I'm going to change this to distant, and anytime I'm working with lights, I want to make sure I'm looking at high quality, or you can even attempt to use your active shade here. But your distant light is going to kind of simulate really harsh sun rays. So the default settings for this are pretty low for exposure because it has such a strong impact. Just to do a quick render, you can see I'll also be taking some of the sheen down by adding a flat material here in just a moment. But really harsh shadows, that's really going to push where those peak details are. They'll be nice and light, and then they create these dramatic shadows. But we're actually going to soften that up quite a bit by adding another Arnold light source. Okay, this one doesn't matter where it is because we're going to switch this to, go to my modifier tab and switch this from distant to Sky Dome. And what Sky Dome does is creates a light source that simulates exterior light, so it's a global illumination, And if I go to my render once again, you're going to see that it softens up the lighting and the shadows quite a bit. I still get that darker, heavier shadow produced by the distant light, but once I take this kind of shininess off with the, this is just a result of the viewport material and the Arnold renderer, it's going to really give a nice soft kind of exterior look. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm happy with the settings, the default settings. I could change the color of the sky, dome light, to kind of tint and give a different time of day look, but for right now, next step is just going to be to add a simple material. I'll create a physical material, and I can use the output node to drop it on my object. And the main thing I want to do is just drop these reflections way down. And you can choose to put a flat dark color on that as well. I'm reluctant to turn on my active shade, but we can just do a quick render again. And when I take out all the reflections and add that matted material, I get a really nice rendering that shows those noise details, because the sky dome produces really soft shadows, so those details peek out, and then I have those nice strong shadows from the distant light. So this really does simulate more of a sunrise or direct sun on this landscape. And of course, with my animation, I can kind of render this at all different phases, which is pretty cool. Alright, so now I can kind of consider my renders, and I'll go back and visit the timing on my animation. Not happy about this quick transition here, but I will tweak that later. And instead what we'll do is make sure we set our render settings to capture an animation that is a series of frames, and the active time segment is the first thing I want to do. And you can see that's going to be from 0 to 100. That's going to be based on whatever your timeline settings are. So if you went longer for your animation or shorter, this will be a number that correlates to the number of frames in your timeline. I'll stick with the preset for HDTV. I could go to 1920 by 1080, but it's going to increase my render time quite a bit. And I want to go ahead and designate a name. You can see I've already got a preliminary test for this, and I can just adopt the same name. You'll notice when you are rendering out a sequence or a series as a static image format like PNG, it's going to create this sequence for you automatically. So it automatically adds the 4 number spaces at the end. So to adopt this and overwrite the same file, I'm actually just going to put a 2 in here just to differentiate that. So I'm not actually going to overwrite the originals, but what that means is the base name is going to be anim2, and then it'll usually separate this with a little underscore, and then you'll see the number sequence at the end based on what the frame count is. So make sure I designate this as PNG. I want to use PNG to take advantage of the transparent background. I'm going to save the settings here. Configuration, PNG configuration default is fine. Just make sure that alpha channel is active and 48-bit is just fine. Okay, that solidifies the settings for your render, but doesn't generate the render. Okay. Last thing I'm going to do is check my save frame. Okay. You can use Shift F for that, or you can click on the viewport mode, and ensure that that is checked on. You can see the keyboard shortcut there. Okay. I'm just making sure that no point of my mountain exceeds outside and gets clipped or anything. So here's where you can benefit from the kind of rounded edge. I'm going to frame this up a little bit better, but I'm actually going to render from here. Just trying to get a nice angle that's going to capture as much of the foreground detail and kind of see the profile of the mountains as well in the back. Just making sure that none of my animation slips out of the frame. I can actually draw this in just a little bit more with my navigation tools. It's another quick test. It's a little too high right there, so I'll drop that down. And that's the highest point, so it should be good. Alright, so again, I'm going to save here. I will bring up my render setup and I will fire away. I will certainly fast forward this part and we'll see the final product when we're done. Alright, so I'll stop the video there. Thanks for watching.